Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we've got a massive, completely fascinating challenge today. How exactly did a rugged little cluster of 13 colonies on the edge of the Atlantic transform into a literal global superpower in just 250 years? I mean, in the grand scheme of human history, that is the blink of an eye. Whether you're a major history buff or you're just looking to connect the dots of the past, we are going to map out the exact turning points that shaped an entire nation. Let's dive right in. Think about it. On July 4th, 1776, 56 men didn't just sign a piece of paper to start a new country. They essentially launched a brand new concept into human history. The radical idea that power comes directly from the people and that certain rights are completely unalienable. And what makes this so incredibly powerful is that it isn't just ancient history, right? It's an active, living experiment that is currently being tested, debated, and lived out by over 330 million people today. To make sense of all this dense history, here is our roadmap. First, forging a new nation. Second, expansion and deepening divide. Third, industry and global wars. Fourth, rights, rivalry, and space. Fifth, the modern digital era. And finally, we'll wrap up with the American experiment today. Let's jump straight into part one, forging a new nation, covering the birth of an idea from 1763 to 1789. It's wild how fast things escalated here. We're talking a matter of years. It really kicks off in 1763. Britain wins the French and Indian War, but, well, they're left with massive debt. So Parliament looks to the colonies to pay it off, rolling out the Stamp Act and a bunch of other taxes. That sparks the famous rallying cry, no taxation without representation. And the momentum from there is just staggering. You go from colonists dumping tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, right to Thomas Jefferson drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Finally, after a brutal 8-year war, General George Washington forces the British to surrender at Yorktown, fully securing formal independence by 1783. But winning independence didn't magically mean immediate stability. Actually, scratch that, it was the opposite. The new nation was incredibly fragile. Their very first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was just way too weak to hold the country together. They had to deliberately construct a functional system step by step. So they go back to Philadelphia in 1787, draft the Constitution, and create this complex framework of checks and balances. And then, to protect the people from this powerful new government, they added the Bill of Rights in 1791 to guarantee fundamental freedoms like speech, religion, and due process. Moving right along to Section 2, Expansion and Deepening Divide. This spans from 1789 to 1877. $15 million. Take a second to process that. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the massive Louisiana Territory from France for roughly $15 million. That is literally 3 cents an acre. It doubled the size of the country overnight. And this massive purchase sparked the whole idea of manifest destiny, this really potent belief that the U.S. was destined to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That belief drove wagon trains west, fueled by huge events like the opening of the Erie Canal and the massive California gold rush in 1848. But here's the thing. As the borders expanded, a really deep, fatal division grew right along with it. You essentially had two completely different visions for the country's future operating side by side. On one hand, you've got a rapidly industrializing North that was increasingly opposed to letting slavery spread into the new Western territories. On the other hand, you have a South driven by this booming cotton economy that relied entirely on the expanded institution of slavery. And despite decades of political compromises trying to juggle these two sides, the tension was completely unsustainable. And eventually that tension just snapped. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter the very next April, and boom, the conflict ignites. The monumental shifts that happened next were incredibly rapid and deeply tragic. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 to free enslaved people in Confederate territory, and gives his famous Gettysburg Address, completely redefining the war as a fight for a government of the people. It all culminates in 1865 with a Confederate surrender, followed tragically just days later by Lincoln's assassination. Take a moment to really absorb this number. Between 620,000 and 750,000. That is the estimated death toll of the Civil War over just 4 years. To put that into perspective, it remains the deadliest conflict in all of American history to this day. The scale of loss was practically unimaginable. It left a completely fractured nation that somehow had to figure out how to put the pieces back together. So, how do you rebuild after something like that? The nation entered the Reconstruction era, and they passed 3 absolute landmark constitutional amendments. The 13th abolished slavery once and for all. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th granted black men the right to vote. Now, while this era definitely saw incredible progress on paper, it was also met with severe backlash and discriminatory laws that would deeply, deeply affect the next century of American life. Next up, Section 3, Industry and Global Wars, otherwise known as the Machine Age, from 1877 to 1945. Okay, the late 1800s and early 1900s, just an absolute explosion of innovation that completely rewrote how humans live. I mean, we're going from connecting the entire country with the Transcontinental Railroad to Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, Thomas Edison's light bulb, the Wright brothers literally taking flight, and Henry Ford rolling out the moving assembly line for the Model T. It's a crazy amount of progress in a short time. And this massive industrial boom was largely fueled by millions of immigrants arriving through ports like Ellis Island, seeking opportunity, and essentially building the modern infrastructure of the nation from the ground up. Talk about historical whiplash. Imagine living through the early 1900s. The nation enters World War I, and then shortly after secures a huge victory at home when the 19th Amendment finally grants women the right to vote in 1920. But then, the economic high of the Roaring '20s crashes violently in 1929. The country plunges into the Great Depression, which FDR battles with his massive New Deal public works programs, and then, out of nowhere, the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor pulls the U.S. straight into World War II. By the time that devastating global conflict ends in 1945, the United States emerges totally transformed into one of the two dominant superpowers on the planet. That brings us to Section 4, rights, rivalry, and space. The Cold War era, spanning from 1945 to 1991. We're looking at a totally fascinating dual narrative here. On the global stage, the U.S. is locked into the Cold War with the Soviet Union. They're founding NATO and competing in this incredibly tense space race that ultimately culminates with Neil Armstrong actually walking on the moon in 1969. But simultaneously, back at home, the country is going through a massive grassroots civil rights movement that forces the entire nation to take a long, hard look in the mirror. What's truly incredible about this period is how everyday people literally took to the streets to reshape American society. They were demanding those exact same unalienable rights that were promised all the way back in 1776. You have Rosa Parks sparking the Montgomery bus boycott, and Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Through immense personal courage and relentless pressure, they secured the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This legally outlawed discrimination and finally began dismantling those deeply ingrained historical barriers to voting. Now we're getting into recent history. Section 5, the modern digital era, covering the rapid technological changes from 1991 to today. It really feels like the pace of history just hits fast forward right here, doesn't it? Just think about the defining moments of the last few decades. The World Wide Web drops and completely revolutionizes global communication. But this era is also marked by profound tragedy and incredible resilience. We have the terrible September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, which led to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Then there's the massive 2008 financial crisis, which was immediately followed by the historic 2009 inauguration of Barack Obama. And of course, the sudden, world-altering disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which, by the way, also spurred the absolutely incredible medical achievement of Operation Warp Speed. And even with all that disruption, the push forward hasn't stopped for a second. The country is still pushing the absolute boundaries of what is possible. I mean, NASA isn't just resting on the Apollo missions. The Artemis program is actively working to put humans back on the moon right now. We are seeing major breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, rapid advancements in renewable energy, and cutting-edge biotechnology. These are the specific fields laying the exact groundwork for what the future of this nation, and honestly the world, will look like. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the American experiment today. Where do we actually stand? The contrast is pretty mind-blowing when you put it side by side. We started with this super fragile alliance of 13 colonies, huddled along the Atlantic coast, with maybe 2.5 million people. Fast forward to today, it is 50 states spanning an entire continent, home to over 330 million people. Through revolution, civil war, world wars, economic collapse, and massive technological upheavals, the nation hasn't just survived. Crucially, through profound struggle and sacrifice, it has continually expanded the definition of who actually gets a voice in its democracy. So, what does this all mean for us? It means the American story isn't just some dusty textbook on a shelf. It is alive. It is currently being written by the people living it right now. And yeah, that includes you.
250 years is a huge, remarkable milestone for any nation for sure, but it leaves us with one incredibly vital, provocative question. What will you write next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.